Today, it's great to chat with Jesse Singal on the podcast. Jesse is a contributing writer at New York Magazine and the former editor of the magazine Science of Us online vertical, as well as the co-host of the podcast Blocked and Reported. His work has appeared in the New York Times, the Atlantic, the Chronicle of Higher Education, Slate, the Boston Globe, the Daily Beast, and other publications. He was a Bosch Fellow in Berlin and holds a master's degree from Princeton University's School of Public and International Affairs. His book, The Quick Fix: Why Fad Psychology Can't Cure Our Social Ills, has just been published. Jesse, wow, man, I just have so much I want to discuss with you today. I read the book and feel like you condemned my whole field, so I can't wait to chat. I can't wait to
I was going to say, like, I feel you're a very good guy and a very fair guy, but I definitely criticized some of your people, so I'm happy to get into it.
Like some of my dearest friends, not just some of my people, but anyway, it's all good. All in the spirit of openness and making the field of psychology better, which I'm all about. Mm-hmm. So I want to kind of go back to the kind of origin story of this. You were at Science of Us. It's around 2015, like around September 2015, or even before that. You're getting lots of press releases. And you're kind of just taking them all at face value. So you're getting inboxes, emails in your inbox. Like, wow, here's the latest new press release. Or here's the latest new study we found this is better than sliced bread. What we found. It's so exciting. It's so exciting. And then, so give me the pre-Jesse and the post-Jesse. So the pre-Jesse would look at those kind of emails and be like, wow, I got to write about it. Because obviously they know what they're talking about.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Well, I think it was a little bit, I do think I noticed something was afoot, and we did a pretty good job at resisting that sort of thing. There was this famous study about hurricanes versus himicanes, where the theory was due to some social priming effect, hurricanes with female names people didn't take as seriously and wouldn't flee from, so more of them died. And this ended up being widely mocked. And we actually, my colleague Melissa Dahl wrote a good article explaining why this likely wasn't true. But I was not skeptical enough, and I felt like I was not actively debunking it. And, around then, a lot of science outlets were very excited about social psychology, and I think didn't maybe apply enough critical thought to the claims that would pass along. And as you said, that problem of writing directly off of a press release is pretty bad, because a lot of science journalists don't read the actual studies, and the press releases often misrepresent them.
For sure. But when did you kind of catch on to that? It was around September 2015, I believe. And I feel like the IIT came on your radar, and then you're like, wait a minute, there might be something to what this person's telling me about, to look deeper into the IIT.
Yeah, I received an email from a guy with some training in psych who basically said, there's a story here. The IIT isn't as good as people say it is. That was when something really flipped in my head, because the IIT, I think I had more or less taken at face value. And I wrote a headline for, I think, a slightly viral study write-up about how white people think black people are magical. And that was based on some IIT result where they I forget what it was, but they associated black people with magical words quicker. And I bet if I could go back now and look deeply into the methodology, I would not have written that study up in that way. But yeah, I went from, but who could resist that headline? White people think black people are magical.
Oh, absolutely. But it's almost interesting to just think, what if you wrote the headline today? That much has changed in 5 years that I feel like it would just have a whole different reception to it. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Once, I think with the IIT, the fact that it was hosted by Harvard and Mahzarin Banaji is a really well-respected Harvard social psychologist, I started thinking, if a test with such big names behind it and such institutions behind it is whatever else you think about it, and there's real debate over how useful it is. I'm not saying it's useless, but at the very least, I think their most impressive early claims have not been borne out. And if everyone can believe in a test like that, what else am I missing? What other ideas am I passing on to readers without fully vetting them? Am I part of the problem? And I think that, that led me down a path toward a little bit more of a debunky role.
Well, it's really responsible of you. I remember those articles that you wrote. I remember that Jesse, vividly. I remember the Jesse from that column, the Science of Us column. Jesse from the Science of Us. I remember that incarnation of you. You know what I mean?
Jesse from the block.
And that's when you first came on my radar, and I was impressed. I mean, I was like, wow, he's he's not doing what every other journalist, science journalist, is doing.
Thank you.
Yeah. So that was cool. So you use this phrase fad psychology in your book, and I was wondering, can you define that? What is fad psychology? I want to make sure that I'm not doing fad psychology in my research.
Yeah, I think we use it more in the title than the book, but it's basically, I've noticed this pattern where a new idea will burst onto the scene via a TED Talk or a book or some combination of them. It will suddenly attract a lot of media attention, often a lot of research funding, a lot of interest within psychology. And then a few years later, when we have more data, it turns out that maybe there wasn't that much there in the first place. There wasn't that much to be excited about. Power posing, I think, is one of the cleaner examples of this, because I think there's like a little bit of a there, a little bit something where maybe it can improve people's, felt sense of power, but nowhere near the claims that were accompanied the original TED Talk. So to me, that's a fad. It's like everyone chasing the shiny new idea without really looking deeply into the strength of the evidence, at least at first.
Yeah. Reading your whole book, and which I read it all in one pass, because it kind of reads like a novel. Like I recommend people, if they have like the 2-3 hours, I think you can actually read your whole book. Perhaps and just reading it, I was left with wow, there's a real deep truth here, that a thread that runs through all of this, which is that if you're that certain people throughout history and also in our generation who make certain claims, they're going to be more popular than other claims.
Yeah.
Regardless whether you're a psychologist, regardless of whether you're a Tony Robbins kind of figure, if you make some claims that suggest that, wow, we're capable of so much more, that there are characteristics that, yes, maybe your environment sucks, but there are things that you can change, and not just change a little bit, but change dramatically.
Yeah.
There are things you can change. People are craving to hear that, especially those who lack hope. I did a statistical analysis, and I've been planning on writing about this. Who reads self-help? Like, I did a statistical analysis of the personality traits that are correlated with.
Oh, interesting.
Isn't that cool? Isn't that?
Yeah.
I'm gonna have to write this up. But I found that it's people with mostly really low self-esteem.
Yeah.
And that's it. I mean, that's the population. You find your target population, you find people with low self-esteem, you say, hey, person with low self-esteem, you can do it. I'm going to give you so much. I'm going to give you the panacea, and they'll be like, oh, I'm listening. Go on.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, yeah.
And I think that's, yeah. I mean, I'm talking a little bit about the history, but there's something particularly American about that, where there's always something in our cultural waters about, if you can just change your mindset, it'll transform your life. And sometimes, with The Secret, this Rhonda Byrne idea that Oprah helped promote, it gets very literal. Like, if you can literally think about a possibility, including a new car, it'll manifest itself. So yeah, I mean, the book is partly a critique of that, but part of the reason I'm excited to be on this podcast is I think you do have some hope that there is some room people have to improve themselves, as do I. The book is more about critiquing overclaimed claims in that regard, but I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Me neither. And I mean, I my whole research career has been wanting to give people hope, in the sense showing them they do have greater potential than they probably realize through. I mean, I developed all these self-actualization tests and everything. I mean, you went very easy on me. You didn't mention me at all in your book. I was like, whew. I was like, oh, because you turn the page. All the psychologists are reading your book, turning the page, and be like, is he gonna hit? Is he gonna write about me? But I'm being cheeky. But we're friends, so I can be that way with you. But
I don't really get the sense that you commit. I don't want to call them sins. No one's getting murdered here, but I don't know. I don't view you as an overclaimer. I view you as someone trying to study this stuff in a pretty responsible way.
Thank you. Well, that means a lot.
We just made this a total love fest. You're incredible, Scott.
Thank you. Oh, thank you so much, Jesse. No, that means a lot to me. I try really, really hard to do it right. You know what I mean? I try hard, and I'm interested in using rigorous science to see what we are capable of changing, and to see what what we could be as a species and as a human. So when you said, you don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater, I'm glad you said that, because neither do I. I definitely want to address weak science, but are we both aligned in saying that one can apply a rigorous scientific approach to evaluating programs and things, and we could find that some of these programs do have large effects. You're surely not saying no scientist is allowed to find a large effect for an intervention.
Yeah, no. I think mindset interventions are actually a good concrete example to focus on here because, when I go on just sort of a normal layperson podcast, I would explain what those are. Do you think your listeners more or less know what mindset interventions are? I could give the quick elevator pitch.
Give the quick.
Yeah. The idea of a mindset intervention is people tend to have either fixed or growth mindsets. A fixed mindset is, this is how strong I am. This is how smart I am. That limits me. I can't improve. So the idea of a mindset intervention, especially with kids, is to change their sense of their intelligence and their academic potential from fixed to growth. So you go from, I failed that test. I'm an idiot. I'll never be smart, to, well, if I work harder, I can do better on the test the next time. And Carol Dweck is sort of the main evangelist behind these ideas, and she was criticized, I think rightly, for overhyping them a little bit. I think she made really big claims about the utility of this intervention, and I think to a lot of debunky science people, it was teetering on the brink of full debunking. Then there was a very big, rigorous study in, I want to say, Nature, that it had all the components of a genuine program evaluation, and what it found was not huge effect sizes, but for the most academically vulnerable kids, this seems to work. It seems to nudge them a bit closer to staying on track for graduation. And it points to like a very specific cost-effective setting, which is, I don't know exactly how they implement this, but let's say halfway through the academic year, you take the bottom 20% of the class and you give them this intervention, and it takes like an hour. So I think at the end of the day, with a lot of these ideas, we might eventually end up somewhere where there's a cost-effective intervention, but the bigger claims that, everyone should do this, or there's really big effect sizes, that's where I'm more skeptical until there's data.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. I do have some responses to that. First of all, David Yeager is a colleague of Dweck's, and he's been writing papers arguing there. I think he even wrote an article called "There is no magic." There's no magical intervention.
Yeah.
So he's been, to his credit, he's been trying to make clear that there are cost-effective, cheap interventions that can move the dial in an education setting a little bit, but they're not magic.
Yeah.
Also, I had Carol Dweck on my podcast, and it was one of the rare podcasts that she agreed to be on. And I didn't hold back anything. I gave her every single possible criticism and went through all the papers. I highly recommend you and the listeners listen to, as a follow-up to this, listen to my discussion with Carol Dweck. I found her to be incredibly gracious, humble, but there just was one moment where I would say my only point of contention. There was one moment where we literally went through all of the findings. She agreed. She's like, yeah, you're right. Like in that instance, yeah, it was a really small effect size. That's why we're looking at specific populations. She finds that those with a low SES and those with few opportunities might benefit more from these interventions versus others. But there was one point I said, so do you still stand by the statement? And I read the statement saying something along the lines that like, it's that mindset is kind of like a revolutionary or like completely transformative. I said, you still stand by that? And there was this moment in the interview, she says she thinks about it. And I mean, we had just gone through all the small effects. I think she's like, yeah, I still stand by it, Scott.
Yeah.
And it was a fascinating, because I consider myself friends with her. Do you know what I mean? Like these things aren't personal, if she's listening, she probably will listen to this podcast. I want to say, I admire her and I think she does great research. But that was an interesting moment because I just don't know if I would have, I think that if I had just gone through all that same data, I think I would have been like, yeah, I think I maybe have overhyped it a little bit. I think maybe I would say that,
I had a very similar, in my chapter on grit, I had a similar thing with Angela Duckworth, I'm not friends with her. I've never met her in person, but she was gracious enough to answer my emails. And she's been pretty good about not overhyping grit and slowing down the grit train.
Yeah, I agree.
But when I asked her about her most famous quote, which is about grit beating the pants off of traditional measures like, intelligence, she wouldn't really back off from it. And I don't think that's justified. I just, there's something we're humans. And once we say something and put it out on the public record, it's probably hard to sort of, in effect, retract it. But I would say the researchers in my book run the gamut in terms of how responsible they've been, and not everyone who accidentally ignites a viral half-baked idea is malicious or did so malevolently. There are errors, there are incentives, but I think where I hope my book will move the needle is once your idea is out there and perhaps getting more attention and acclaim than it deserves, what do you do at that point? Do you rein it back in, or do you just keep doubling and tripling down? And I hope more researchers make the right decision on that front.
Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to announce that Athletic Greens is a sponsor of this podcast. Athletic Greens is the most comprehensive daily nutritional beverage I have ever tried. I've been using their product religiously for the past 7 years or so, and it consistently makes me feel healthier and more energized throughout the day. Look, with so many stressors in life, it's difficult to maintain effective nutritional habits and give our bodies the nutrients it needs to thrive. There's so many things we do throughout the day that can leave us deficient in key nutrients. This is where Athletic Greens can really help. Their daily all-in-one superfood powder is the easiest and most delicious nutritional formula that you can add to your daily routine and empower you towards better habits. Personally, I treat drinking Athletic Greens like a ritual, waking up in the morning and taking it to start my day off right. It has replaced my multivitamins, and it tastes really good. One tasty scoop of Athletic Greens contains 75 vitamins, minerals, and whole food sources ingredients, including a multivitamin, multi-mineral, probiotic, green superfood blend, and more that all work together to fill the nutritional gaps in your diet, increase energy and focus, aid with digestion, and supporting a healthy immune system, all without the need to take multiple products or pills. Athletic Greens is continually improving their formula based on the latest research, and they go above and beyond in third-party testing to ensure their customers continue to receive the highest quality and best daily nutritional formula on the planet. This product is also lifestyle friendly, whether you eat keto, paleo, vegan, dairy-free, or gluten-free, and contains less than 1 gram of sugar without compromising on taste. And right now, Athletic Greens is doubling down on supporting your immune system during the winter months. They're offering my audience a free 1-year supply of vitamin D and 5 free travel packs with your first purchase if you visit my link today. This is a really great deal, especially considering that a lot of health experts are noting the importance of vitamin D and its direct impact on supporting the immune system, especially during colder months when there's less sun exposure. Simply visit athleticgreens.com/psychology and join health experts, athletes, and health-conscious go-getters around the world who make a daily commitment to their health every day. Again, simply visit athleticgreens.com/psychology and get your free year supply of vitamin D and 5 free travel packs today. Okay, now back to the show. Yeah, you made a really good point. Like, scientists are humans too.
Yeah.
And we're it's not a very on the whole, science is not a very glamorous field. That's the word I'm trying to look for.
Not like podcasting.
It's not like podcasting. That's right. That's why I was like, yeah, I'm going to the podcasting route because this is a lot more fun and glamorous, and I get to show off my hair. My hair looks good today, doesn't it, Jesse? But
anyway, I think it's great. You put effort into mine. I'm just at full Jufro deployment. No combing, no brushing. Not very professional. I hope my publisher is okay with this.
That's hilarious. By the way, I'm being ironic and joking. I don't think my hair looks that glamorous.
Well, but, you know what? Yeah. I'm not sure everyone can see it the way I can. I think it looks great, Scott. So,
well, thanks, Jesse. But I almost said humans are scientists too. Scientists are humans.
Also true.
Also true. I was like, actually, that's both. It works. But let me just articulate all these points I wanted to articulate today because it's such tricky territory. Like to get grants. Here's for instance. I'm giving you like the inner world of what it's like to be a scientist because it's really not easy. Okay, yeah. You're poor as F, right? You the only thing you have to not be homeless that separates you from being on the homeless is getting a grant sometimes. Yeah. And to get a grant, they actually say in the grant application, tell us why your research is like the greatest thing since sliced bread. Like they are essentially telling you to do that. And I remember working on grant applications and definitely overhyping for the sake of getting the grant. Not lying. I try to never lie, but just like saying how oh my God, it's so exciting. We found this correlation here, and we want to keep working on it. So there's that mechanism. There's something that just occurred to me on reading this is like, I think it's important to hold scientists to a high standard, but here's my question for you. Like, yeah, okay, the book is picking on scientists, but like, why do we hold scientists to a higher standard than, like Tony Robbins kind of figures? Like, why do they get, or here's another way of framing it. Why do they get a free pass just because they're not scientists?
Oh, I
Do you
like
see what I'm
that.
saying?
Well, but that's sort of one of the points of my book. I don't think I make it explicitly, but one of my
Yeah.
critiques of social psychology and positive psychology, and this is something positive psychologists themselves have worried about, is that it's creeping
Yeah.
a little bit close to like self-help. And I
Yeah.
think in some ways psychology and self-help have become intertwined. And
Yeah.
the reason I wouldn't spend a book teeing off on Tony Robbins is because I think it's so obviously wrong. Whereas some of these ideas, they have like Ivy League institutions behind them and helping to hype them up. So it's like in my social world and my parents' social world, these ideas are very popular. So I think I can do more good debunking them. Self help, I mean, I think Americans spend $10 billion a year on self help. That'll always
Yeah.
be with us. And I think psychologists should want to differentiate themselves from that.
I, yeah, I hear what you're saying. I just want to dive deeper in this point because it's been bothering me for a while. Yes, as these two domains become closer and closer to each other, because they really are, especially with the field of positive psychology. I mean,
Yeah.
it's no doubt. Um, why don't we? Why aren't we all interested in the truth, regardless of who it comes from? Because the thing is, I can't tell you how many conversations I have with really, really big time best-selling self-help book writers, and I'll say to them, like, where's the evidence for that? Where's the evidence for that? Where's the And they say, well, I'm not a scientist and I don't claim to be a scientist.
Right.
That's what they say. And then it's
Yeah.
like free pass. And then and not only that, but they do get a free pass by saying that.
Yeah. I
But
mean,
why shouldn't I feel like let's bring everyone together in the room, from every stars stripes. I think that's kind of even a broader spirit of your book. I just feel like your book even has an even broader message I'm trying to articulate. You know?
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so if let me think that through. If
Yeah.
schools were bringing in self-help figures to affect their curricula, I would of course critique that. What's more likely is they'll bring in
Yeah.
social psychologists, but a counterpoint to that is some of the more cutting edge diversity, equity, and inclusion stuff that both schools and companies are paying for is basically self-help in that there's
Mm.
often no evidence for it or no solid evidence. So that's a case where like it's not only psychologists delivering those programs, but whoever delivers them should be held to account. Anyone who is trying to make money off an idea that makes certain claims, I agree with you completely. I wish we were all more scientific in
Yeah.
evaluating all of these claims.
Yeah, and that no one like there's like there's no outside the realm of science. Like you
No.
can't like we I think this is just becoming an increasing problem in our society right now is that with conspiracy theories, with ideas that there's no such thing as objective truth, now
Yeah.
like everything is subjective. I just seeing a larger problem, a larger trend of just like, well, look, you have your belief and that's science, and I have my belief, which isn't science, and let's just all have our different belief systems. And it's like, well, I don't know about that when it comes to things like evaluating whether or not certain interventions will work or whether or not um, uh, we should apply things large scale. Um, I don't know if there's anything else other than the scientific method to help us evaluate that. I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I think it's all we got. I mean, how else do we know what ideas work and what ideas don't? And that doesn't mean that just because science has proven something, it's right. I mean, that's the whole point of
Right.
my book. But
Right.
I just think most Americans and most people, I don't want to sound elitist, but they're not great critical thinkers because critical thinking is difficult, and it's easier to accept a story that sounds good and that we want to be true. So yeah,
Yeah, I think we're definitely on the same page of that. But we can start going into details of all these as we deconstruct my whole field. Okay, so I want to circle back to grit, but let's cover the IAT for a second because you brought up most recently you brought up the diversity trainings.
yeah.
What does the rigorous research when you looked into literature show about the effectiveness of these kinds of trainings and the use of the IAT in those trainings?
The biggest meta analysis suggests that there's some interventions that can maybe change your IAT score. I should say your IAT score is inherently noisy because the test retest reliability is so low. No one's been able to come up with an intervention that actually changes behavior, and behavior is what we care about. Because if the theory wasn't that your IAT score points to behavior or predicts behavior, I don't think anyone would really care about. So the IAT, I believe, in terms of changing individual behavior, I'm not aware of any evidence of interventions that actually do that.
Yeah, and also that's a really good point. The correlation is very, very small between the IIT score and your actual instances of discrimination, racial discrimination in the real world. Now,
When that's even been measured, that's mostly been measured in lab setting. So even there's sort of an external validity problem. But yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting because Greenwald still vehemently defends the IAT, I believe.
Well, not only that, but Banaji was on a Today Show segment like a month ago that didn't. I sort of almost rage quit over that. Like there was in the year 2021, no one should be doing these segments that doesn't at least acknowledge the statistical critiques, and this exposed the test to potentially millions of more people who won't be aware of that. So that frustrated me.
Yeah. The one thing that always occurred to me as kind of as cool about the test is that I think it can tap into an understanding of the societal's most prevalent associations or things that, like I do think the media has an effect on our unconscious associations, et cetera, et cetera. It to me, it's much more interesting as an index of cultural, consciousness.
Yeah, that would be true, except for the fact that there's some evidence that it's measuring other stuff, not just like actual cultural associations. So there's some evidence that if you are, the more aware you are that Black people are oppressed in society, that gives you a higher SAT score, IAT score. That's different from saying that you've actually internalized cultural messages. And part of the problem here is an individual IAT score appears to be a complicated mix of different things and has, to my mind, been overhyped as like this is actually measuring your implicit bias. Your broader point, though, is totally true. I'm sure implicit bias exists and affects some outcomes. I just don't think we have an accurate way of measuring it.
I agree. So I agree with my point again, and I agree with your point. I was like, I agree with both points, but one of them was my point. But yeah, yes, this stuff can get tricky real fast. So let's say that you do the IIT and you find that people in the Black Lives Matter movement have more racial bias according to the IIT. What would that even mean? Like that I wouldn't want to argue, and they certainly wouldn't want to say that they are more racist unconsciously, even though they're explicitly less racist, right? So the thing is, there are multiple ways to interpret this, and one more parsimonious way is that perhaps the more that you engage it, that these ideas are in the forefront of your consciousness all the time, like you're seeing everything through the lens of race. Well, the associations are going to be quicker to activate, with some things that you keep seeing over and over and over again. If you're constantly fighting in the world of social justice and you keep seeing these things linked together by, if you keep seeing, it's in your consciousness, your millisecond reaction time is going to be quicker.
One of the seminal early papers critiquing the IIT was titled, "Would Jesse Jackson Fail the Implicit Association Test?"
Exactly what I'm talking about. That's
exactly. Yeah. As I mentioned in the book, I wrote a long article about this for New York Magazine. Some conservatives interpreted that as me saying implicit bias isn't real or isn't important. I think implicit bias is absolutely real. I think how important it is in the overall pie of America's discriminatory outcomes is very much up for debate, and that no one's, to my mind, really been able to show it's that important versus other stuff, but it could be. We could learn that.
Yeah, and there's some really important interactions here with neurologically speaking, with the prefrontal cortex. I wrote an article about that for Psychology Today about I feel like 10 years ago, but reviewing that research showing that there are huge moderator effects that explain whether or not some of these associations do become correlated in the real world. There are moderators that can move that correlation higher and lower, because we ignored everything else and we said all else equal, the correlation is weak.
Right.
But there are some factors that make it more likely than others. If you have a very if you're a very impulsive person, or your personality is, you have a very poor executive functioning, you kind of go like immediately from thought to action.
Yeah,
you know,
that makes
then
sense that you'd
yeah,
be more susceptible to implicit forces. Yeah, that's
boom,
interesting.
boom,
Yeah.
boom. That's right. I'd like to take a moment to talk about a really cool podcast, the Addy Hour podcast. As we all know, this past year has been really difficult. From lockdowns to social isolation, to racial injustice, to political turmoil, to lost lives and lost jobs. We're all craving a major dose of life satisfaction, connection, and emotional health. The Addy Hour podcast explores the topics and questions you've been thinking about and creates a unique space to talk about them. Dr. Nee Addy, Yale professor and researcher, man of faith, sports and hip-hop fan, and mental health advocate, and his guests explore a holistic approach to mental health today. Too often one-dimensional or dismissive approaches to mental health and emotional wellness prevent people from getting the help they need. The Addy Hour podcast focuses on the intersection of brain science, mental health, faith, culture, and social justice through dynamic conversations with community leaders, scientists and researchers, professional athletes and entertainers, faith leaders, mental health experts, and advocates. You can listen to the Addy Hour podcast today on the Apple Podcast app, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Okay, now back to the show. Okay, so thanks for bringing that up and telling me about the nuances of that. Let's move a little bit. Let's dive into grit. Now, look, Angela is a dear friend of mine, and my office was right next to hers at the Positive Psychology Center at Penn, which you also take down. And for 5 years, I love that you said sorry. I mean, there's obviously no, you don't need to be sorry.
But this is it's an interesting real world example of how you're not just criticizing ideas, you're criticizing a person, and perhaps. This book was easier to write because I wasn't writing about my friends, you know?
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
So, but that tells you something about why ideas persist sometimes. So, yeah.
They do. But I also bring this up because I just feel like I can speak to it from like a first person perspective of like my experience of the situation, because I would have so many. Angela would come after a long day of work. My office was right next door to hers. I had Imagination Institute right next to the Grit Lab, so that was fun. Yeah. So she would come right next door, and she'd be like, "Hey, do you want to walk home? Today?" And I can't tell you how many amazing conversations we had. Walking home to her house, and then I would have dinner sometimes at her place. She would cook dinner, and I would have dinner with her and the family. And she's like ravenously curious, and she's so bright. She's so bright. She's so quick. And I remember all of our conversation. I remember our conversations were so stimulating, and she. I mean, we would really get into it. We wouldn't always agree. I think sometimes maybe I did think IQ played a larger role, even though at the end of the day we both have criticisms against IQ. But she would just. I would tell her about a certain paper, and she'd be like, "Oh, tell me more about the paper." She's ravenously curious. I really do think she wants to. I think she's a good scientist. A. B. I think that she really does want to know all these various correlations, but she really does believe in grit, and maybe that's a problem. Maybe it is. Maybe to the extent to which one believe in their pet construct to such a degree that and I would even make this case argument again with intelligence. This happens again. Human scientists are human, and I don't know if any scientist is exempt from that. I look at intelligence researchers all the time. By the way, I kind of wish you took them to task a little bit, Jesse, because they believe in their construct. Like, I mean, talk about and believing in a construct, and maybe in a lot of ways, it was important for Angela to kind of try to shake up the field a little bit and say, look, it's not all about intelligence, and hard work does play a role in it.
Well, I mean, so it's interesting because personality psychology had been studying conscientiousness for decades. And often what Angela found with grit was similar to what they'd found with conscientiousness in terms of these correlations. So I think by the time I was done writing that chapter, I'm not sure American society that this was a new, like, obviously it was new enough for everyone to latch onto it and be excited by it. But because we're so self-helpy and we so value as Americans the value of grit and hard work, I think what you're saying, if you say it's true among sort of achievement researchers, I'm positive it's true. I'm just not sure that it was ever the case that like Americans undervalued the importance of grit. I think we've always been into that. Yeah.
Maybe the split between what scientists focused on versus what the general public focused on, and the second that the two aligned more, that it was like wildfire.
I will say, like, it's noteworthy to me that in both her book and her TED Talk, she straightforwardly is like, we don't know how to improve grit, which already gives her points in terms of scientific integrity a lot of other researchers lack. And that's always stuck out to me about her, even if I disagree with her on some stuff.
Agreed. I have found her to be quite intellectually honest, and this is more of the spirit I get from her after knowing her personally. I mean, she'll be like, let's try something else to see if we can learn. Like she'll say, yeah, we don't know yet, but let's try lots of things. And she'll have lab meetings where people will discuss ideas. I mean, she had this idea. She's like, how can we objectively study grit? Like, let's come up with ideas. And she had this idea. She tried this. Her and her graduate student tried a bunch of studies where they looked to see if you could predict someone's grit score from just objectively looking at a college applicant's prior history of quitting clubs. You know, like you can actually look at their past history and see and count up and tally how many times they switched from one thing to another. And it's quite a reasonable way of getting it.
The problem with that study is this is
you know about it.
I do. This is a critique that I had to relegate to a footnote. She and her colleague or colleagues took a pre-existing College Board instrument that is not grit, and they just sort of said that that's grit. So they correlated that resume task. They correlated with this other instrument that, if you look at it, is clearly measuring something other than grit. And they just said, let's consider this grit. So that's an example of like the slight slipperiness I don't always like. And if we were having this conversation offline at a bar, I would give you a chance to like look into it and make sure you agree with my critique. But that's just an example of like, in some cases, I think some of the research is a little bit overhyped.
Yeah, and you're probably quite right that it is overhyped. Certainly overhyped by educators right now. I mean, who are all treating it like it's the panacea. Again, like everyone's looking for a panacea. You know.
Yeah.
And then within the science field, I think it probably is in terms of measurement, and Angela agrees with this because I've been trying to come up with a Grit 2.0 scale with her. We actually we have a draft of a Grit 2.0 scale we were working on.
Oh, that'd be fascinating to learn more about at some point.
Yeah, and I have like 3 data sets of analysis on it. Basically, she fully admits that those items could be improved to more tap into what she really was trying to get at, because the problem is that there's a difference between concept and measurement. The way I think that the spirit of what she was bringing to the table was really new, saying, oh, I think there's something that conscientiousness misses out, and that's kind of the long-term perseverance and commitment aspect. And I don't think that she fully captured that in her grit scale, and I think that's been such a source of all these problems, you know, because all scientists have to do to try to validate her theory and everything is using her grit scale. So then they find it's pretty much conscientiousness, particularly the industriousness aspect of. If you want to really nerd out, you can zoom in and say it's pretty much, you know, perseverance aspect is pretty much the industrious aspect of the big 5 conscientiousness facet. But
and I know her critics, even her fiercest critics, said there is this one little nugget of potentially useful stuff. So like no one's discounted the scale.
Exactly.
I'll be interested to see what Grit 2.0 looks like. That's really interesting.
Yeah, and maybe let's leave it at that, because in the spirit of not tearing down people, but in the spirit of perfecting the science or getting the science better. Because I think that should be what it's about, really. I don't like some of this infighting. I don't like it, quite frankly. I don't like the scientists who get personal about it, and then you know, they want to they become in their mission to take down, you know, a fellow scientist. Let's just all improve the science, because I think that in the spirit of doing the science better, I think Angela would agree, and I certainly have discussed this with her, and I think that, you know, there's these couple items that even Marcus Creed, who wrote that meta-analysis, said, well, there's something here with these kinds of items that are more long-term based perseverance that is doing most of the prediction. And my goal would, my thinking and my spirit about this is like, let's perfect a scale or let's get a better reliable scale that like zooms in on that,
Yeah.
double clicks on that and shows what's really unique about the grid concept. Because I do think there's something there. It's just I see it as a measurement issue, quite frankly.
Well, I mean, it could be the same general trajectory as mindset interventions, where you start with a lot of hype and then there's some debunking, and you end
Yeah.
up with like something that is useful to some researchers in some contexts.
Awesome. Well, isn't this great that we're getting so deep into this?
Yeah, man.
So can you explain what it means to be living in, quote, the age of fracture?
Yeah, Age of Fracture I took from with credit, I didn't steal it from him, from a Princeton historian named Daniel P. Rogers. His idea is that in mid-century America, Americans and sort of public intellectuals understood that we're all parts of these big structures. We're all, a lot of people are members of civic institutions or churches, religion, ideology. These all, there's structure to life. And that doesn't mean that anyone would want to go back to the 1950s, especially if you're like the wrong gender or skin color. But his overall argument is we've gotten more and more fractured, and American life is seen as more and more atomistic. And the way I connected to this to my book is if we're all just individuals floating around in highly competitive markets, of course we're going to both want to optimize ourselves with the latest and greatest tweak. And of course, we're going to be susceptible to explanations of the world that rely on things like priming and biases at the expense of like, how wealthy are you? What's your local social network like? So, yeah, I think Age of Fracture is a really important book, and I hope a lot of people read it after they read mine,
Cool.
of course. Mine's
Of
one
course, of course. Well, thanks for introducing me to that concept, because I was not aware of that. So I actually do want to go in and read that literature.
Yeah.
I would like to double click, or not double click. I would like to return to something I was talking about earlier. I said is there's nothing else other than science really if we want to rigorously test large scale interventions. But I suppose there's this other voice in my head that says, at the end of the day, like if a self help thing, even if it's not scientific validated, if it helps you,
Yeah.
like isn't that all that matters? So there's this other voice in my head, because that's a refrain I get a lot from non-scientists who write self help books. I'll say to them, but like there's no science in this, and they're like, but my grandma says it helps her, and that's all. Like at the end of the day, if it helps people, I get people will say to me like, but I get hundreds and hundreds of letters a day saying how much my book changed their life.
Right.
Now, what would you say in response? I know what I think I know what I would say, but I want to hear what you would say in response to that.
Let's take power posing as a concrete example. There's probably some people for whom standing up straight before a meeting, hands on their hips like Wonder Woman for 30 seconds helps. There's nothing wrong with that. But if the creator of power posing gives overstated or false explanations of why it might help people, that's a problem. If it doesn't help people on average, we shouldn't say it does. There's also just the issue of like averages are averages. Like a power posting could have a net negative average on people. I'm not saying it does, but even if it did, there could still be a subset of people for whom it benefits, and that effect could be washed out by everyone it hurts. So, if you read a self-help book and you find it inspiring, I would just be real. One of the first things we learned in AP psychology is that people are not good at evaluating themselves and understanding what helps and hurts them. And that's one of the reasons we have clinical psychology. So I think maybe the power posing helps you because you're taking deep breaths during it, or because you're just giving yourself 30 seconds to collect yourself before the meeting or the negotiations. There oftentimes might be other explanations for why these interventions feel like they're working than what lay people think. And I think there's a role for critical scientific types to try to explain that.
And also the placebo effect is really
Yeah.
can be really big. My colleague at Stanford, Ali Crum, doing really good work on that. And I was actually surprised you didn't bring in Ali Crum's research, because I think that'd be a cool way to incorporate some of your ideas as well, because she's found that the mindsets you have over when you enter a certain one of these conditions can dramatically improve the extent to which you actually get benefit from them, especially in a placebo situation. Like if you really expect this placebo thing to change your life, you'll be much more likely for your life to be changed.
Yeah, and she's done some interesting stuff, I think, with like food and calories and mindsets too.
Milkshakes.
Yeah.
I think she has a title of one of her papers, "Mind Over Milkshakes."
That's a great title.
Yeah, she's great. I went to grad school with her, so it's so like it's cool to see like your grad school buddies like become famous and awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah. So should we tackle self-esteem now, since we're taking it all down? We're not taking. We're burning it all down.
Just destroying everybody. Yeah. I mean, I could start with like the kernel of truth, the self-esteem that I mentioned in the chapter. If you think you're completely worthless, if you have very low self-esteem and you interpret every event negatively, and you have a bad date and you assume that that's a signal you'll be unloved forever, then some cognitive behavioral therapy would likely help you. And there's some solid evidence for that. And that's a facet of self-esteem, right? It's your mindset about yourself. My chapter is about this craze that took over in the 1980s and the 1990s, mostly thanks to one California legislator named John Vasconcellos. Pretty soon, like the whole country and a number of other countries thought that self-esteem could sort of fix everything, that self-esteem lay at the root of problems ranging from academic underachievement to literal murder. And it became a fad and a craze. And we now know Baumeister, actually, around the turn of the century, did like a big study where he looked at all the past literature with some colleagues, and they found like there's very little there suggesting a strong causal role for self-esteem. But as always, baby and bathwater, we need to keep two thoughts in our head at the same time. The craze was over the top. People don't kill one another because of low self-esteem usually. In fact, criminals have high self-esteem, is an interesting finding. But also, if you have incredibly low self-esteem, CBT can help.
Yeah, and by the way, researchers have found there's no such thing as low self-esteem. It's really uncertain self-esteem. You actually find when you do look at distributions of self-esteem scores, very few people say they have no self-worth. It's usually around the midpoint or at the high point.
Well, that was one interesting Baumeister pointed out, is that all this talk of an epidemic of low American self-esteem, he was like, where is it? Americans are very, very high on themselves. We're very like Lake Wobegon-ish.
Yeah, it's important to distinguish between self-esteem and narcissism. I think sometimes people when they make fun of people, they use self-esteem, they're really referring to a different phenomenon of narcissism. So there's a lot of important nuances here. Like I think that it's good to have a basic sense of self-worth and a sense of self-competency, but as I argue in Transcend, because I have a whole chapter on self-esteem, and Transcend is I think it's a healthy self-esteem is a basic human need, but it's one that shouldn't be pursued for the sake of being pursued. It's one that should emerge organically from real earned accomplishments and being a valued social partner.
Well, I'm not a big Ayn Rand fan, but John Vasconcellos took his enthusiasm for self-esteem from a disciple and lover of Ayn Rand named, I think, Nathaniel Branden. And his whole point, which I think Vasconcellos sort of missed, is like there's the fake self-esteem of looking in the mirror and trying to convince yourself you're great, versus the organic self-esteem of like, oh, I've accomplished some stuff. I have a beautiful family. Things are going well.
Yeah, exactly. Good. I'm glad that you did this. I'm glad you wrote this book, Jesse. I really am.
I am too.
Yeah, I'm glad you wrote it. I think it needed to be written, and we need to be having these conversations, even if people don't, agree 1,000% with every single sentence you say. Even some scientists might have some quibbles, especially the ones that you wrote about. I think they might have some quibbles.
And I look forward to reading them.
And I know you are looking for. I know that you're open. You want to have that discussion.
I do want to give a lot of credit to my editor, because he was the one often pushing back and saying like, well, this idea isn't, Alex Starr is my editor. This idea isn't bunk. We shouldn't assume everything here is bunk. Obviously, there's some element of your posture that matters, or your self-esteem that matters. So he was he's himself a skeptical guy. He has to be as a book editor, but he was whispering in my ear, like, let's not go too far in the other direction. And I think the book benefited a great deal as a result. So I didn't want to take credit for that.
Yeah. I saw that. I saw those sentences where you'd go through a whole long 2 pages and there'd be the paragraph, but maybe we shouldn't. Maybe that was his influence of inserting. But I noticed that it followed that pattern. You know what I mean? Like you'd go a couple and then you'd have, but look, maybe there's something here. If we because there's this other study that did find maybe something promising. So you did throw a bone
I tried
every
to,
now
yeah.
and then. No, that was nice. That was very nice of you.
Thank you.
I think just like the last topic I just want to discuss with you, which is a very heavy topic, is the fact that the human brain really has an easy time latching onto monocausal accounts.
Yeah.
And I mean, you've written about this. You have this Blocked and Reported podcast where you're not afraid of saying politically incorrect things, for the sake of if you think they're true.
Yeah.
Do you see a problem right now with people latching onto kind of racism as the single cause of so many disparities as opposed to looking at multi-causal accounts?
I think yes and no. I think I'm recording this from my parents' nice suburb of Boston, and I think anyone who knows the history of Boston or most major American cities understands that the suburbs were built by racism and to support racism, and only certain people had access to them. And if you read Tom Segru on what happened in Detroit in the 50s, where there were black families with money, and they wanted the same thing white families wanted. They wanted more space, more living room. They tried to sort of move into the Detroit suburbs. They were met with armed mobs of white homeowners. This stuff happened in the lifespan of people who are still alive today, and often hasn't been talked about. So part of the pendulum swing has been, let's talk about that. But people don't always do a great job understanding how complicated structural racism can be. And like you're saying, we've gotten to a point where I do think sometimes whenever anything happens, it's assumed to be racism as the root cause, just because that is the current conversation. The tragic recent example we saw was this mass shooting where, for structural reasons, the I don't know if these women were all sex workers or just masseuses, but the women targeted were mostly Asian, not all Asian. I think 2 white women died, but a lot of the coverage suggested that he was motivated by racism when it seems like he was more motivated by these horrible far-right ideas about sexuality and his shame and this sense that these women had tempted him somehow, which is it's ludicrous to blame your own issues on women, first of all, and of course ludicrous to then attack them. My argument for a long time has been if we reduce an event like that to one cause, whether it's racism or whatever else, we're not going to be able to stop the next attack because we're fighting with one hand tied behind our back. And I think in liberal spaces, you would probably agree, this is seen as a very important conversation, but the good faith attempts to understand events can sometimes bleed into opportunistic attempts to signal that you're on the right side of an issue. So if you go online and you say this anti-Asian racism has to stop, it's not just an empirical claim about what happened, but you're signaling like, I understand this is a serious issue. And of course, anti-Asian racism is a serious issue. But again, that's different from whether we can reduce this particular attack to it. So that's my basic stance on it.
Yeah, that was really nuanced, and that was a very Jesse response. So
Thank you.
I appreciate.
I'll take that as a compliment.
Yeah, because and you should take it as a compliment. But I think that it's spot on because like I'm deeply interested in closing achievement gaps with various racial ethnic groups, and they're actually called excellence gaps. You actually see at the top 2% of standardized test scores. I mean, it's huge discrepancies.
Yeah.
When you get to the tails, but it's a multi-determined issue.
Yes.
It just makes no sense to say the answer is just racism. There's poor schooling, there's poverty, there's sorry.
And also you don't need to like. I think one of the conservative beliefs that I'm softer on now than I was 10 years ago is that like family structure actually matters a lot. If you have 2 parents to look after a kid, that matters a lot. That doesn't mean we should morally judge people who have kids early on. It means it's harder to raise a kid. Everyone knows this. Everyone who's college educated tries to have kids with a partner who's there. But something like that, like having a kid earlier than you should, that is also connected to structural racism because of access to education or contraceptives. You can still make that argument if you want, but like you're saying, to reduce every part of this achievement gap to like, people have tried to claim the SAT is particularly racist, which I think you're sort of letting a lot of institutions off the hook because like we want schools to be better. We want people to have better and safer families. I've observed the same thing. I think it's Not to derail us, I got a really interesting email from a medical resident, and he said that socioeconomic determinants of health, is this really important new idea in medicine. Like whether you're healthy or not healthy has to do with a lot of things, like your level of social support, your education level. If you're a diabetic, do you have access to testing strips? Do you know what to eat and what not to eat? He said he arrived in medical school excited about this new area that could improve lives, but the shift recently has been the only socioeconomic determinant of health they talk about is racism. Everything is racism. And that doesn't help. We need to talk about racism, but we need to talk about other stuff too.
Yeah, and that's can generalize to the other conversations we had today. Like I spent my whole career trying to understand what are the determinants of greatness. What are the determinants of high achievement? And you just you could say grit matters, but you can say talent matters, but it's a lot more interesting when you start looking at the multicausal interactions. People who are more talented are going to be more motivated to put in the grit.
Yeah, they get feedback.
There are these level of nuances that when you double click, you're like, oh, it's the interactions that are interesting,
Yeah.
The multicausal interactions. Anyway, Jesse, thank you so much, brother, for being on my podcast today. I think you wrote a really good, important book, and I hope everyone reads it, and I hope that we can do better psychology as a result.
Thank you. I really appreciate you having me here, and I hope we can get together in person sometime soon.
Wouldn't that be nice? Thanks for listening to this episode of the Psychology Podcast. If you'd like to react in some way to something you heard, I encourage you to join in on the discussion at thepsychologypodcast.com. That's thepsychologypodcast.com. Thanks for being such a great supporter of the show, and tune in next time for more on the mind, brain, behavior, and creativity.